Welcome. Welcome to today's webinar, Understanding and Knowledge Regarding Behavior Support, an emphasis on children with deafblindness. My name is Jerry Petroff, and I'm a professor at the College of New Jersey and the executive director of the Center for Sensory and Complex Disabilities. I am also a consultant as well as an advisor to Mondo Charge in Italy. So let me give some opening remarks. First, I just introduced myself. Unfortunately, I wish I was there with everyone so we can introduce you and who's listening or taking advantage of this webinar, but you know a little bit about me now. I'd like to review the agenda of what we're doing today, and then to tell you what to expect for the next 60 minutes or so. So here's the agenda. These are the opening remarks. We're going to then progress into a peek into the child's brain, which is critical to understand what we know about the brain and how it relates to human behavior. The basics of human behavior from a behaviorist point of view, and then a summary and final message. What I want you to expect is that you will gain a foundation to understand human behavior and the behavior of students, children, infants, adults who have deafblindness, including those with Charge syndrome. So it's understood if understanding is impossible, knowledge is necessary. How is this quote relevant to what we're going to do? Well, sometimes children with deafblindness make it impossible for parents and children and teachers to understand why they do what they do. So exploring the function of their behavior is critical, why they are performing what they're performing. Human behavior is a complicated situation, and it is influenced by a variety of both internal and external variables. Internal meaning emotions, the way people feel, and external about the environment and how it affects people. Another person's behavior is often presented to us as a mystery to which we need to solve. Therefore, the following presentation is an attempt to understand the basics. This presentation is going to be a good beginning to understanding and knowledge that will influence our skills in behavior support. So in other words, to understand these fundamental understandings, we must have those in order to proceed. So today, I'm asking you to be open as possible to different perspectives regarding human behavior and the manner in which you approach challenging behaviors. Perspectives are influenced by what we have experienced in the past and may have been taught. And in this case, the way you have been disciplined by your own parents, teachers, and others. So my ask for you is keep an open mind. So let's review a little bit about children with deafblindness, including kids with Charge syndrome. First, the disability is not deafblindness necessarily. The disability is about access to information and communication. Who and what is around me? What's going on? And then how can I tell them I'm scared, uncertain, need more information? What's happening? A deafblind child is trying to do this. This is the process in which a deafblind child, or all of us, go through. What's happening? What does it mean for me? What do I want to do about it? How do I get my body to do that? This process for the hearing and sighted children come quickly, but for deafblind children, it's a process. a process in which many of us just don't show the needed patience of waiting. You saw the piece. You will see the piece by Dr. Van Dyke in a minute, which will show you one example of processing information from Dr. Van Dyke being introduced to a very young little girl. Let me play the video.
There I come. There I come. There I come. Aha. There I come. There I come. There I come.
So what you just saw was Dr. Van Dyke's first attempt to interact with this young girl who didn't know him prior to this experience. If you want to evaluate exactly what was going on, he gently approached her, gave her time, repeated some action, went away, made very distinct differences, and then engaged again, where she pulled her hand away. She touched him, and then she pulled her hand away, and he respected that. At the end of Dr. Van Dyke's career and life, he was working all the way up to the time he passed away. Here's something he came to say. He said, "In observing these children in their educational program, I became aware that the theories which we have been developed over the years were inadequate for this population. Their quality of life is not determined by focusing on development of cognitive skills or symbolic communication and concept formation, but on their emotional well-being." Well, as teachers, I would say, wait a minute, it is important to develop cognitive skills. It is important to participate in the world with symbolic communication if we can. You must form concepts so that you can develop more sophisticated language. And he would respond that it's all true. However, first and mostly, the emotional well-being of the child must be put in place. That's the most important thing before you can proceed on and we can see more and more growth. That's an important point for you to remember. What do we mean by emotional well-being? Well, as little negative stress as possible. And he would always say that deafblind children have a lot of stress throughout the day. As many pleasurable experiences as possible, and safety and security, which is rooted in the healthy attachment with the principal caregiver, or in other words, their parents, their teacher, and other people that are important in their lives. Now, all those things, as a parent, are exactly what I want as priorities for my own children. I want them to be free of stress. I want them to experience the pleasures of the world, and I want them to be safe and secure and have a healthy relationship with me. So it's the same thing that any other child would go for. What I want to proceed from here is to peek into the child's brain, okay? What we need to understand regarding a child's brain in order to provide support and learning is extremely important. And 30 years ago, 20 years ago, somewhat even 10 years ago, we haven't had the kind of information that we have today. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about the physiology of the brain, a system within the brain called the limbic system. and the fundamental influences of the environment and the people within it that are influenced, are influenced or interact with our behavior, as well as has roots in our brain. So, what emotions have you experienced in the past 24 hours? Well, I've experienced joy from the first cup of coffee I had this morning, to frustration from a work task, anger after talking to a parent who was experiencing negative interactions with her son's school, stress because I had to film this session and wanted it to be perfect. We all have this range of emotions that happen all day. Why is it that we can regulate them? And we see a lot of times young children can't regulate their emotions the same way. And sometimes deafblind children even more. So what triggers your emotional reactions? Well, I said them before. People do, places do, times do. Sometimes even a word will trigger an emotional reaction, or language will do it. Will do that. Again, an important fact that you need to think about when you're supporting children with deafblindness, or frankly, any child. What we do is we react or respond. We often either are reacting or responding to our unconscious or our conscious set of circumstances or situations. Did you ever respond to someone's comment and thought to yourself, why did I just snap at that person? Well, there are reasons why that happened, and they all lie in the way that your brain functions. The conscious or the unconscious, right? So the emotional brain, this is the parts of the brain that have to do with emotions and where they are. You see them here in the brain, the amygdala, the limbic system, and then our complex thoughts and memories, the parts of your brain that are dedicated to the way we feel our emotions, as well as the parts of our brain that are responsible for complex thinking, are exactly what we need to understand. For example, you are on a nature walk, enjoying the birds and the trees, and all of a sudden you see a snake in your pathway. Right? Your brain responds by thinking it could be poisonous. You feel threatened by it, right? Complex thinking. You've known that, right? Then you respond with fear and you run as fast as as you can. The emotional brain has taken over. Most of this reaction has nothing to do or trumps your cognitive and complex thought. You emote before you think. So this is called the limbic system, and these are the parts of them. They control emotions and memory, emotional control and fear control, regulates fear and aggression. You've heard of the fight and flight response. It's when you fear and you just take off, or you try to avoid it. Our kids with deafblindness often experience this. So because of our emotional brain, what do? Well, the first thing we do is we feel before we think. Everything that we sense has already been filtered through our emotional brain. So think about that, all right? If I am presented with something novel or new, and I'm not sure I like the way it looks, the first thing I do is I feel a negative emotion to that. And I do that right before I have time to even think it through. That's where our maturation as adults come in. We get more and more experiences knowing how to regulate those emotions once we feel them. However, we always feel before anything, before we kind of think. You should be thinking about the sensory challenges of your children with deafblindness. This may begin your deeper journey into understanding their behavior. When danger is sensed, we react emotionally first, before the information has reached any part of the cerebral cortex, which is the part of the brain that is for thinking, for rational thinking. That allows us to process and think rationally, that cerebral cortex. So, when what we sense reminds us of a past threat, we react with the same intense emotions. We may not even be aware of the memory that has been triggered. So in other words, we have deep reactions to our sense memories. If one of our children have a very bad experience at school, and I will show you an example of this later on in my presentation, coming back to that same school, or coming back to that same experience, they are going to be threatened unless we start teaching them, not even unless, they'll always have that sense memory, but how do we control it ourselves? And what do we do? What do we do as people who are going to provide behavior support? In order to think rationally and respond rather than react emotionally, we need to allow the information to reach the rest of the brain, which takes a little time and a lot of processing. Processing that our students with and children with deafblindness often are hindered by, because they don't have the same quality and quantity of information through their eyes and through their ears, which are very reliable, most of the time, reliable ways that human beings gather information. We can do this by becoming aware of our emotional triggers and learning to take a moment before reacting. Okay, that's a great goal to try to teach. These skills are key components of emotional intelligence, and everyone can learn their emotional triggers with supports, and we can learn. How do we support or teach this? Well, what would you do to make him have better behavior? We think about that. We think about, well, what are the triggers? Where are we going? Where, what will this produce? Parents have a unique way of understanding what triggers their kids' behavior, and sometimes how to avoid those triggers. But we'll proceed. There are more features of the brain that influence behavior. What I show you here is actually just a picture from a video. It's a video of a man who just found out that his son was going to get a heart. They were waiting for a long time, and it's touch and go, and it's his talking to his son. The purpose of this was for you to go maybe at another time and watch that video and see how you reacted, because what I'm about to do is show you that a special part of our brain that processes things emotionally. When someone yawns and you do too, this is an example of mirror neurons. Mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are neurons in our brain that connect by what we see, hear, and feel from our environment, and we share those feelings. Similar to, I see someone yawn and I'm going to yawn, or I see somebody with a face like this gentleman and I don't feel happy. I reap from his sadness. So, if you go through that, did you feel anything? And there are experiments that we can do, but this gentleman was one that discovered mirror neurons a long time ago by accident. So what he discovered is an interesting story. He had doctoral students working with him in his lab as they were trying to study the reactions, where reactions of the brain were by using MRI and other technology. And his doctoral students were having a lunch break, and they were eating lunch right where the monkeys that they were experimenting with were. And as soon as they saw that the doctoral students were eating things, the monkeys started pantomiming exactly what they did. And they looked at that and said, wait, why are they mirroring what I'm doing? What is this? Is this something we should be looking at? From that experience came the philosophy or the theory of mirror neurons that we know exist. So it's the mystery of the emotional brain. Neuroscience, Dr. Rizzolatti, who was with his colleagues at the University of Parma, first identified these mirror neurons. And said that the neurons could help us explain how and why we read other people's minds and feel empathy for them. You've all been at a movie that no matter how many times you watch, you tear up, okay? You, especially at the parts where you're seeing people in distress, in empathy, you're gaining empathy. If watching an action and performing that action can activate the same parts of the brain in monkeys down to the single neuron, then it makes sense that watching an action and performing an action could also elicit the same feelings in people. You're probably wondering, well, what does this have to do with deafblind children? Well, mirror neurons have a lot to do with also behavior. Okay, they are used for us to understand and connect with others. If we don't see or hear, maybe just our ability to access what we see, feel, or understand of others is diminished, giving us less opportunity to develop our own empathy. That's why when people say to me, this deafblind kid has no empathy to others. Well, that's not true. Okay, that's not true at all. We all can share an empathy, unless there is a very serious psychiatric problems, but that can be developed in children. Knowing all this about the brain, how does it influence the behavior of children with and without deafblindness? Well, a great deal. It really does. Because if we feel before we think, and we don't or do have access to others' emotions and connections, then the absence of those skills that produces will show itself as a behavior problem. So let me ask, have you ever had a problem behavior? Have you yourself ever behaved poorly? Right? What was that problem? What was the reason? And what could you have done to prevent that? So a colleague suggested to me that I don't check my email. I responded with a nasty email confronting their perception of that. The problem behavior was shooting off a nasty email. I could have just waited, okay, and process this criticism to see where they were coming from, and responded with, let's talk about this when I get in the office. But no, my emotion, before I thought, reacted. But what triggered it? It must have been, what triggered in this case was, maybe I don't answer my email in the same timely manner as everyone else does. I don't want to make an excuse for that, although I have plenty, but that was it. So To me, I would say to myself, well, to prevent that criticism, maybe what I do is give the expectation of when I'm going to answer, within what time I'm going to answer emails, and provide that to everyone so that I don't have to get that criticism, and then for me to stay within that time frame. So we move on to the basics of human behavior, but we don't leave what we just learned. What do we need to know about human behavior in order to provide support? Now, you'll notice I'm talking about humans, all humans, because the key to behavior support in children with deafblindness is the same key that it is to have behavior support for your husband, wife, partner, for your friend, colleague, or just an acquaintance. Effective behavior change is based on support, not management or modification in most cases. There are cases in which we use that. All human behavior has a purpose, and it is maintained by the environment and others. In other words, there's a reason, and I do it again because I get reinforced in somehow. Applied behavioral analysis, ABA, that term is thrown out a lot. It's often associated with the interventions of children with autism, but I'm going to widen it for this presentation to the very basic of what we mean by applied behavioral analysis, which will come. And then what skills do we need to support the behaviors of others? What are the interventions that are based on what I'm going to promote? Positive behavior supports, and you'll understand that before we're done. So there are a variety of ways to build healthy social emotional status. However, human behavior must be understood by both the underlying brain function as well as behavioral technology, meaning applied behavioral analysis, or the behavioral explanation of how behavior is shaped or exists. So in order to do that, I'm going to offer you a few lessons in supporting positive behavior in others, some understanding. The work of a behaviorist goes beyond stimulus response, and it's certainly more complicated by a variety of variables. I mean, it's influenced by the environment, the people in the environment, the internal feelings, that maybe even pain, okay, past experiences, and it could go on and on and on, which makes it very difficult for us to understand human behavior, but not impossible. So a new and better informed behaviorist understands that we know stuff about the brain and that we do have applied behavioral analysis, and we could use applied behavioral analysis theory or with practices that lend themselves more to prevention than they do to consequence. I'll explain that in a second. So the first lesson that you must learn is understanding the human spirit. Us humans are come into this world with the world on one side, and there we are. And we try to keep a balance, how the world influences us and how we influence the world. When it gets too much, when the world looks like it's really controlling us, that's when we have behavior problems. You've all had one problem a day, but did you ever have multiple problems in a period of time where all of a sudden you saw yourself changing? Your behavior became negative. Maybe you were making decisions that were not just like you normally. This isn't probably an influence of how the world is controlling you, and you feel out of control. There's nothing you can do to get control. And what happens very often is that we look for ways to get control. And sometimes those ways are not very productive, or not very kind, or not very effective. So there are ways that you see on this PowerPoint that say How can we address that? Well, giving opportunities and choices are one way. I remember that I remember that my mother long ago came to one of my presentations on behavior. And I was staying with her for a week or so to get things done in her house. And she had gone to this behavior presentation. She wanted to see me what I did. And I came into the house and I slept and then we woke up and she said to me, "Oh, Jerry, would you like to help me vacuum, or do you want to take out the garbage?" I said, "Look, Ma, I'll take out the garbage." And then I thought to myself, she just gave me a choice. I went, "Where'd you learn that?" She goes, "From you." You said giving a choice. I know if I told you, can you take out the choice out the trash, or could you vacuum? If I didn't give you a choice, you wouldn't accept that as well. And she was absolutely right. I guess I'm a good teacher. Compromise is often a good way. I know that you want to go to the playground, okay? But unfortunately, we can't. But let's see what we can do instead. Would you like to go for a walk? A walk outside around? There's a compromise. Finding compromises gives everyone equal access to their own autonomy, so to speak. Acknowledging communication. This happens a lot with children with deafblindness. If you don't see the communication that somebody is trying to tell you, then they're going to get frustrated. They're going to say, no matter how much I communicate, these people have authority over me. They're not going to listen to what I have to say. I'm not going to get any part of my way. So another, maybe an example of acknowledging communication is a short experiment I did in one of my classes once. I would answer a question. I would tell this class, I'm asking questions. Those of you who respond are going to get extra credit because I then know you read the article. So I proceeded, and I picked out ahead of time 3 students that no matter what they did to raise their hand, even if nobody else raised their hand, if they raised their hand, I looked at them and I looked away. What I found was one student said, "Dr. Petroff, I've been raising my hand from the very beginning. I'd like you to please let me have my piece, or let me say something." The other 2 just faded away and wouldn't participate. At the end of the lesson, I explained to them what I did. We all had a laugh, but it gave them a lesson about the importance of control when you acknowledge other people's communication. Think about the kids with deafblindness that may not have sophisticated language or are emergent language, emergent symbolic skills. The other is active listening. It's very difficult to communicate with somebody who is either rehearsing what they are going to say back, or they're really not listening to you at all. Okay, and then it becomes you become deflated, and you don't think that you're being heard. That also, so you could either talk bad about that person or not, attempt to give your message. Feeling a sense of belonging is important. I can tell you, even though I don't necessarily have hard research on this, I will tell you that I have met dozens, if not hundreds, of children who were put into programs that didn't want them there, and that their sense of belonging created in themselves such a strong sense of not wanting to be there that their response was what others called problem behavior. And all they were saying is, nobody wants me, I could feel it, and therefore I'm going to do anything I can to get out of this. Then a feeling of a sense of freedom. Do I have any choices that I can make? Am I going to direct my life in any way? Even the smallest senses of freedom are really critical. So I would examine your classroom and examine your family and say, well, what decisions does that my child with deafblindness make? And are there any decisions that I can give to them? It's very important. Let me tell you another story about my own son. So when my son Parker was a very little kid, he was only, I think, about 3.5 or 4. I was the only one home taking care of him at that day. And I woke up and I wanted to do a good job. I washed his face, I brushed his teeth, I picked out his clothes, I got him clothed, and then I said, okay, Parker, I'll meet you downstairs because I made your breakfast. He comes downstairs, and in his hand, he had a battery. Yes, a battery from a toy. And I said, do you need new batteries for upstairs? No, Daddy, I want to bring this to school. I said, well, you can't bring things like toys or things like that to school. And bringing a battery, it doesn't do anything. And it may not be safe to do that. And he started crying. And I started elevating, saying, I'm sorry, this is the parameter. You can't bring the battery home to school. You can't do it. He cried and cried and cried. And finally, I said to myself, oh my God, he did not make the only decision he made that day was to take the battery. And I even took that away from him. I thought about it and I said, Daddy is sorry. He made a mistake. Can you keep that battery in your coat pocket all day? I'm sorry, I understand. And from then on, I had him participate in his teeth brushing, his care, what he was going to pick out for clothing that day, which, by the way, most of the time was not what I would pick out for him, but I was giving him that freedom. That's an example. So take that example and see how many times we do that in our classrooms or in our homes. So we're going to move on to the second lesson, is understanding how it works through applied behavioral analysis. You're finally going to understand what my understanding of applied behavioral analysis is. So in applied behavioral analysis, when we're analyzing someone's human behavior, how do we define what is and what is not a challenging behavior? That's the first decision we need to make. Many times I see parents or teachers in particular say that this behavior bothers me. He is making sounds with his mouth, and I can hear it while I'm teaching. I said, okay. I said, and I need to have that stop. Okay, well, how loud is it? Well, it's not that loud, but it's annoying to me. Is that the challenging behavior that we're going to work on? Or should we work on your challenging behavior that you don't have the ability to tune out somebody who is maybe providing themselves with some regulation, some feedback for something, or whatever? With many deafblind children, we must interpret what is our problem versus what is the child doing. What can we use to prevent challenging behaviors? That's what we're going to talk about. And when someone exhibits a challenging behavior, what choices do we have to reduce the likelihood that it's going to happen again? What are our choices? So they all lie in the applied behavioral analysis. The decision is the key to positive behavioral supports. So the ABCs, all behavior is triggered by what happens before it, which we call the antecedent. What happens before it triggers us to do a behavior. What happens after it reinforces that that's the behavior that we do. So that's important to understand. And we have two choices here. I'm making this simple. We can concentrate on the consequences, which means you had that behavior, you're going to, you're going to be punished, or we're taking something away, or it is not good. Or we could focus, when we can, on the antecedent. What made you do this? And how can I have you either do it a different way, or do it or not do it, or eliminate the variables that I think are triggering that behavior, and then reinforce it with positive reinforcement. Great job. Thank you very much, which we're going to explore now in this lesson. It's important to understand that regardless of how we manipulate this beginning antecedents after the behavior consequence, it's important to note that the brain has an influence on how we behave and learn. So remember, I'm keeping you to go back all the time to the brain and all those functions of I feel before I think. So therefore, my behavior may be not congruent with what the environment has. So let me give you some basic facts. Some basic facts. How do these facts explain challenging behavior in those you support? Connections the brain finds useful become permanent. Those not useful are eliminated as the brain selectively strengthens, and it's a neurological term, prunes connection based on experience. So in other words, that your brain learns, right? It thinks and it learns. It has memory. If it finds a solution, or if it finds a behavior really is working for that kid, okay, or for that child, it could become permanent. Once it becomes permanent, it's more difficult to support or to replace. The ones that don't, they get eliminated selectively as the brain selectively strengthens and prunes the connections based on that child's experience. There are other examples I can explain by that, and we'll do that a little bit later. Emotions play an important role in learning, and emotional experiences have a high probability of being permanently stored. I'm afraid to say that my 48 years of working with students who are deafblind has shown me that we have done a lot. We have done a lot, and I've seen a lot of children have permanently stored reactions that worked for them all the time, and that they become almost permanent. Let me give you an example. When a child wants someone to come over to them or wants some attention, I've seen a lot of deafblind kids hit their head. When a deafblind or any child hits themselves, what happens? Mother comes over, aides at school come over, teachers come over, because we don't like to see kids hurt themselves. The kid with deafblindness says, oh, this is how I get people to pay attention to me. I'll just hit myself. And then when other people don't notice it much, and I need it again, I'll start hitting harder and harder and harder until that becomes the reaction. Okay. Those things that are permanently stored are harder to replace. The ideas generated by the brain often come in images. So what does that look like for our deafblind children? Images. Or do they also come from tactile experiences? Betcha. Anybody here who knows a child who is tactily defensive understands that their ideas generated may be a response from bad experiences touching things that they didn't like. We'll go on. The brain has a persistent interest in moderately novel, an environment that contains mostly predictable stimuli lowers the brain's interest. So giving kids brand new novel things often are, especially kids with deaf blindness, are often approached or matched with, I'm not doing that. I don't know anything about this. I can't figure this out. But giving kids moderately novel, hey, I know this game, but it has a little bit different than the ones I had before. Let me see if I can shape a new understanding here. And then there is the seminal wise reflex. Okay. This is where the brain is wired to dismiss or reject things that are totally different from what we currently understand. So it isn't a good idea to give brand new, only a novel experiences to our children, especially in the early development. Give them experiences or materials or things that are new, because they might just dismiss them. So we always have to match it with something that is familiar with them and more and less novel. Okay. The truths, these truths have been reinforced to me by my friend and colleague, Dr. Richard Blumberg. He says that, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, that people repeat behaviors that lead to rewards, and if there is no reward, a behavior isn't repeated. So those of you who have problem behaviors in children or see problem behaviors, it's most likely being rewarded by something. And yes, things that you call problems are really having a purpose for that kid, or it has already turned into a permanent reaction, which we take other kind of more deeper steps to help support. If a person's behavior is reoccurring, it's being reinforced. We also attend to different things to tell us when to perform certain behaviors and when not to perform others. So in other words, did you ever see that kid in the classroom, teachers, that you say, okay, everybody line up, but their nose is still painting or painting or coloring that picture. They're still down there. They're oblivious to your direction. Well, they are concentrating on different things. I think that happens very often. So we have to remember that just because we think we're the stimulus, that doesn't mean that's what the deafblind child or a child is paying attention to. If a person is not performing what you want them to do, a desired behavior, the person either doesn't know how to, or when to, or isn't being rewarded sufficiently for doing it. Yes, that's true. But kids with deafblindness often have difficulty with modeling behavior that they can't see or understand. And so even though we think we're clear, it's not clear to them, and they don't know how to do it. Okay, let's move on. Some basic assumptions also, that most behavior, regardless of how unusual or extreme the behavior is, and I know that many deafblind children have behaviors that parents are like, I can't believe he's doing this, or why is he doing that, or why is she doing that? Why is she sleeping? Why? And parents and teachers have the same thing. They can be identified in each of us, though. Those behaviors are not so unusual. They are just different in duration, how long they last, frequency, how often it occurs, intensity, how intense they perform it, or discrimination, where and when it occurs. They're all just different then. Other than that, you give me a bizarre behavior, and I will tell you how that is seen similar in just each and every one of us, or some of us. Let me tell you a story about that, and then maybe that will illustrate this. Kids like self regulation, right? And a lot of times you'll see kids with deafblindness poking on their eye so that they can get some reaction there. They poke it so hard that some of them damage their eye, or they are biting on things and chewing things, very, very difficult. These are all behaviors that we see in each other. The first time I taught at the college I taught now, I taught a class of 18 young women, many of them having long hair and being around 18 to 19 years old. So I'm in the class and I'm teaching a methods class in special education. And I see a few of them doing something with the bottom of their hair, taking something, looking at their hair, and then doing something with it. I ignore it. I'm thinking, okay, that must be a way for them to regulate on how I can pay attention to me. But I was really puzzled as to what were they doing. So about the fourth class in, I stopped everybody and said, I really got to know, what are you doing? What are you doing with this? And they say, well, I'm just looking for my split ends and doing that. Well, why would you do that? Am I not interesting? No, Dr. Petroff, it just helps me hear you better. I need it. It helps me. It soothes me. I have millions of stories just like that. So all behavior actually serves a purpose for everyone, for each individual. Not all behavior will respond to the same intervention techniques than it did for another individual. So that's the bummer in the fact that we have to create interventions that are really tailored to individuals, not just it worked for him, so it's going to work for them. Those of you who say, I cannot find what's reinforcing to my child, what they really like to do. That's because we weren't looking hard enough. Everyone has something that is reinforcing to them. These are just a list of some of them. So I encourage you all, find the reinforcers for every child that you work with. What turns that kid on? It would be important as a reinforcer for the consequence of a good behavior. Okay. I just want to warn you that using food as a reinforcement is not the best choice. We call that primary reinforcement. However, we use it sometimes because it's a way in which we are clear about what reinforcement this child does. Lesson 3, understanding problem and challenging behaviors. Okay, children with deafblindness are often over-controlled. That's right. Everybody's controlling them. They're over controlled. They have very little autonomy very often, right? So I say to you, look at what matters to that child and what control or authority does that child have. And in the middle of those is where we need to work. We work. When a child is over controlled, how do we give back control around the things that matter to them? Right now, this all has this giving back to authority. How do we give others authority is dependent on age, situation, safety, etc. We start small, right? We start small, the same way as I told you about the Parker story, giving back authority. So rather than trying to gain more control when they're trying to control something, especially over the things that matter to that kid, you ask yourself, how do I give this kid authority? How do I give this kid some control in their life? And if you go back to my other slides about choice, etc., these are ways that control can be influenced. When someone you are supporting or educating is engaging in challenging behavior, you can view them as causing a problem, which I hope you don't, or you could understand the challenge as a feedback that your support is not adequate in some way and try to figure out how to do better by listening to them. And listening isn't just by the ears, but it's about what they do and the patterns of behavior, etc. So I charge you all not to think this kid is causing a problem in my classroom, but to say, what am I not doing to support this kid's better behavior? So behavior is influenced, right, and rooted in overall skills and competence. A lot of our kids with deafblindness are on the journey to becoming more and more competent. Self-determination, which is a huge word that says, I have my willpower to make decisions for myself and to advocate for myself. And that happens in many different ways. And if it isn't shaped and it isn't given appropriate ways to self-determine, take it from me, they will find ways and you're not going to like them. Then there's self-regulation, play, and entertainment, especially children with charge. Their self-regulation is really critical. It really does influence everything in their entire life and living, from balance to getting homeostasis or evenness, to getting the right support of stimuli in. It is rooted in that. And so we provide that. Sensory diets, there are other things that we can do. And then social interaction and communication. It's influenced by our social interaction, as I explained before. These are ways that they're rooted that we need to take into consideration. Now, bad breath is better than no breath at all. This, again, is from my colleague, Dr. Richard Blumberg. What does he mean by that? Well, you know, do any of you bite your fingernails? Okay, and maybe even though you know that you shouldn't, but you're getting attention for that, maybe not. Or do you know, or any of you know a kid who will do something bad just to get attention? Well, that bad behavior is getting them what reinforcing and what they need. So that's why bad breath is better than no breath at all. I can tell you a story about my son who had a problem also he found out in school when he was in, I think, 4th grade, that if he said something funny, the class would laugh. So that reinforced him to say things funny because he's a shy kind of kid. The teacher calls me up and says, Dr. Petroff, we have a problem. Bray is learning that he could make the class laugh, and it's really disturbing, instruction. So I said to her, okay, well, let's figure this out together. This was a great teacher. And together we figure out a way of giving him the attention he needs without disrupting the class or in other ways. Sudden appearance of a problem behavior is a response to illness or major change 85 and 90% of the time. So if a kid does something new all of a sudden, you better look at the first thing we always look at. Is he hurting? Is he sick? Are there things, is he being bullied, happening at home? All of those things that would give an example of that, of why this is occurring. So most challenging behavior may be considered a form of communication. And if you listen back to what I've been saying, of course, but all have or have had a function for that child, that individual. They all had a reason. Now what is this guy saying? He's protesting. He's saying, no, I'm against it. I'm against it. That's communication. This guy, well, not so much. He's just reacting to a physiological problem that he's having. It's really not communication. So we have to be careful about what behavior is where and what's the function is for that behavior. So lesson number 4, understanding old and new approaches. Okay, so I said before, you remember, behavior is influenced by what happens before it. It's triggered, and then it is reinforced by what happens after it, right? Somehow. The traditional approach has been to rely on the consequence, and that the behavior problem is a pathology inside the person, and the solution is fix that kid. So we manipulate consequences through either rewarding them or punishing them, which is taking away things from them. How you were disciplining a child, okay? A child is a really important question to ask yourself. In most cases, our approach to behavioral challenges in others comes from the way your parents disciplined you, which is a problem. I have been many times disciplining my child in a positive way, or all of a sudden I say to myself, oh my God, that was my mother just then. You might have all experienced that. So you need to work either with it or not. That's a decision. I don't know how any of you have been disciplined. So my concerns with this traditional approach is that punishment doesn't lead to long-lasting change. Quick changes, but not long-lasting change. So hitting, a child means that you're going to have to increase the hitting and increase the hitting and increase the hitting to places where it is abuse. Over-reliance on positive reinforcement can lead to sabotaging the motivation of the child. If everything the kid does, you are like, that's great, that's wonderful, oh, you're so great, then they're going to start deciding, well, everything I do is great. Okay. And, instead of using positive reinforcement in a sufficient way, then incongruent with humanistic values. I just don't believe that controlling others through that punishment or negative consequences of those times are really good. I don't think I think it goes against my relationship that I think I have with kids and people. Can be easily abused or misused with devastating results on the human spirit. We only have to go to the studies of the institutions for individuals with intellectual disabilities to understand why we have put them, at least here in America, why we put them in institutions that would put 150 people in a room naked with 2 caregivers in there to feed them and etc. And why did we get there? How did we get there? What made them do that? And there are a lot of studies, the Milgram study is one that talks about that. So it can be easily abused if you allow someone to give punishment. And we have an alternative. That's a good thing, right? So before I go to the alternative, let's look at these things. Behavior modification, changing someone's behavior. No. Behavior managing their behavior. No. Bad behavior. It's not bad. Every behavior has a purpose. Bad children. There are no such thing as bad children. I don't know. My cousin has a child recently that I see, but I don't want to call them bad either. So consider that and then get it out of your mind, okay? Because we're going to take a look at behavior support. That's what we do. We support behavior so that it makes sense and that it's positive behavior that we want, and we replace it with the function, the same power that the function of the bad behavior or of the challenging behavior has. And that's the new approach to behavior challenges, where we view behavior just as a response to the environment, and the environment has people in it, right? And things. The behavior has a function for the person. There's a reason. And the solution is to figure out what what does the behavior serve for that person, and then support more appropriate behavior. You see, the methods, we perform functional assessments and design contextually appropriate interventions that focus on changing the environment and an emphasis on prevention, right? And in a follow-up to this overview of behavior would be to learn how to conduct good functional assessments and develop behavior support plans that fit this construction of and definition of positive behavior. So positive behavior supports, here's a definition. It's a general term that means the application of positive behavior interventions and systems. Its nickname is PBS in English. It recognizes the basic tenets of all of the behavioral psychology I imparted on you. It's fundamentally different than the traditional application of behavior modification. It's not behavior modification. It is replacing it and supporting good behavior. So my opinion is that we need to go from the traditional approach to the positive behavior approach. We have to, that is based on a limitative approach, is the traditional, where positive behavioral supports is based on an educative approach. Why is he doing? Let me think again, let me experiment. Where the traditional approach is, let's just get rid of the behavior. Uses traditional behavior control, which I explained before. This looks for ways to give control. And then dependent on consequences, where positive behavioral supports looks towards antecedents and always uses positive reinforcement on a schedule that makes for behavior replacement. This is reactive and this is preventative. A huge researcher and writer on positive behavioral supports long ago said the big picture. If all we do is reduce problem behaviors and leave the person in an isolated, boring, controlling context, we have failed in the larger purpose of behavioral technology. Kids who have challenging behaviors are often isolated in boring places or have a very controlling context. If that's all we do to reduce that behavior, we've missed the boat. So the question is, I guess the inquiry is, what questions would you ask if somebody was having a challenging and problematic behavior? Well, the first question should not be, how do we stop them from doing this? But rather, why? This is my son, very, very long time ago. He is now 24 years old. And I said to him once when we were down the beach in New Jersey. Oops, sorry. Son, what are you looking for? And he said, everything and stuff. And that's exactly what we have to do. We have to say, we have to look for everything and stuff. And sometimes the answers are in peculiar ways. This is functional. So here are 5 questions that I'm going to offer you. Okay. I'm going to offer you that Dr. Carol Gotthelf, and myself have created over 2 decades ago. When is the person most likely to engage in that problem? When is he to do that? What specific events appear to be contributing to the problem behavior? What triggered it? All right. What is the thing? What function does the problem behavior serve for that person? What might the person be communicating through this problem behavior? And this is the most important question. When is that person most successful and therefore less likely to engage in problem behavior? I want to see what that looks like, because I want to replicate the things around the environment, the techniques around that. So let me give you some case studies with the permission of the parents of these 2 young men that I'm going to introduce you to. Shaquan and Nicholas. And Shaquan and Nicholas, I'm going to introduce individually, okay? So Shaquan, he was 19, he's older now. His etiology was rubello German measles syndrome. He has profound bilateral sensory neural hearing loss, and he has congenital cataracts, corneal opacity, and as well as glaucoma, and that makes him very deafblind, okay? So here is Shaquan at a clinic that I have, in which Dr. Van Dyke, as well as myself, were holding years ago. That is his teacher, the deafblind specialist, Miss Linda Getz. She's teaching him Braille. Pretty good, right? Dr. Van Dyke is watching. This is a kid who is learning early grade 1 Braille, sitting with his teacher, and who knows, and you notice she never controls his hand. She always put her hand under his, see? Under his, so that he could always get away, right? Okay, let's move on for a minute. Here was Shaquan now.
Come on.
This is his mom trying to encourage him to go to school.
Come on, honey. Come on.
Here he is again. This is him again. His mother is trying. His mother and family are terrific with him, but this was him trying to get to school, which was different than what you saw before when he was going to school. So, what questions would you ask about this change of behavior in Shaquan? Well, if it was me, I would say, well, why all of a sudden why is he resisting school? Well, let me tell you the backstory. There was an incident on the bus in which there was no videotape was lost of what occurred. When he got to school, he was immediately rushed into the school and given things that weren't very pleasant. He didn't like to do. He had no control whatsoever. He decided, this is not for me. I'm 19 years old. I am not doing this anymore, and I'm not going to be put in harm's way. Very difficult, but it made sense to us. How we solve that is for another training. Okay, here's Nicholas now. He's 19. He has charge syndrome. He also has bilateral high myopia, bilateral colobomas. He is, another textbook deafblind child. Okay, so this is then. Here he is. I'm going to go and let you see both. There he is, ripping off his clothes, hitting his intervener, who has protection on his arm for a reason. Nicholas was experiencing very serious, challenging behaviors, okay, and would hit his head and all the things that I've kind of peppered into this presentation. Let me show you him then after.
Where's your keys? Where do you want to sit? Hi, boss.
Here's Nicholas in a new situation. After this session, he wanted to watch. But look at him. It's a much different thing. Now, his mother was concerned that when he didn't have that, he was concerned about some of the things that he was doing at home. But why can he be here? Like, why can he do this? After this session, he came up to my office and we watched videos that he liked around amusement park rides, and we talked about it, etc. He has less expressive communication than he does receptive. His mother, has clear communication with him, and is just terrific. So, what questions would you ask about this change of behavior in Nicholas? Well, Nicholas went through some very difficult medical problems that we didn't even expect, and was also removed from school. A lot of changes in his life until it was settled down. His behavior was exhibited like you saw. Okay, so the behavior analysis of positive behavioral support is inquiry-based functional behavioral assessment. And I will have resources that you can reach out for around functional behavior assessments. It's inquiry-based. Why is he doing it? When is he doing it? How is he doing it? And collecting data to do that assessment. Then we develop a behavior support plan, our best hypothesis as why, and how do we replace it. And then we have ongoing data collection. And maybe we get it wrong the first time and we do it all over. And maybe the second time and we do it all over. So behavioral analysis is a very systematic, data-based approach to behavior problems. The specific protocols for functional behavior assessment leading to behavior support plan are beyond the purview of this introductory session. Again, if you're interested, inquire to Mondo Charge. If you or your organization is interested in in-person trainings, offering additional and skill-based behavior support trainings, that is a discussion that can have. So let me finish with some summary thoughts and then some summary pictures. It is important to understand that the context of any behavior support is a relationship. If you do not have a relationship with someone, you are not to address their behavior. It's almost impossible. It is critical. In my opinion, if you don't have a relationship with someone, you can't even teach them. Most choices understand that we can't underestimate the need and want to self-determine. I want to get my way. I want to make decisions on my own. We can't underestimate that. A lot of children with deafblindness may not be saying that, but that in the way that you can hear it, but listen closely. Most choices should not be dismissed as bad, but as functional. It's functional for that kid, for that individual. And that goes for anybody in your life. Discipline with dignity, adult behavior correction is, it really needs to be looked at, please, because undignified ways, putting people in undignified situations is really bad. We always are teaching others how to behave towards us. It's always that way. So make sure you're teaching people how to behave towards you by how you behave towards them. And if you're into punishment, all the kid is going to see is that, well, that's the way that I'm going to punish. I'm going to behave towards you as well, providing punishment, right? And a lot of our kids know how to do that well. Be tough on issues and soft on people. And talking does not necessarily mean that you're communicating or you're listening. So, my final thoughts: the best behavior support that can be found is within friendships and relationships. So let me give you some final words of wisdom that come from me with a set of pictures. Age is not necessarily a factor in friendship. Get that out of your brain. I have many younger people who are friends of mine, and I have many older people that are friends of mine. Unfortunately, at my age, the older ones are not that much older anymore. Friends can sit together and share a lollipop, and that can be enough. That could be enough. Sharing a lollipop together, but not even interacting, that could be enough. Some things are better done alone, and that goes for all of us. Children with deafblindness need some compression time to be alone. We sometimes don't want people in our lives. Friends can have 2 legs, 1 leg, no legs, or sometimes 4. Friends, there are no criteria in terms of what they look like and who they are and how they function as human beings in reality. And friends help friends do almost anything, right? So transferring some of our support to the support of the people around, maybe peers, maybe other teachers, is not a bad thing. Friends eat together, okay? They eat together. So, finding ways in which kids who don't eat orally or anything else can be in that social environment is a really good idea. Friends relax together. Everyone needs a hug once in a while. And Italy is as friendly as New Jersey, just to let you know. And unusual friends can be found in the most common places everywhere. So I want to thank you very much for listening to my to this webinar, and I look forward to any comments or any further questions that you may have through Mondo Charge or my own organization. Thank you very much.